Imagine waking up tomorrow and none of it works. Not the internet, that's still there, not the electricity, not entirely, but the thing that moved goods from a factory in one country to a shelf in another has simply stopped. Factories in one country wait on parts from a factory in another. Neither one moves. Cargo ships sit anchored offshore, engines idling, waiting for instructions nobody is actually sending. Food that was grown, harvested, and ready to travel simply sits ripening past the point of use because nobody actually told it where to go. The supermarkets is still standing, the doors are still open, but the shelves are bare because the truck that was supposed to arrive at 4 a.m. never left its depot. And the depot never got the order because the system that decides what gets shipped, where, and in what quantity has gone completely silent. Your banking app still opens, but the numbers on the screen don't move because behind that numbers is actually a vast, invisible web of transactions, clearinghouses, and a trust, and that web has gone completely dark. This isn't some kind of a natural disaster, ladies and gentlemen. No war has been actually declared. No infrastructure has been bombed. The roads are intact. The ships are intact. The workers are still there, ready to work. What is actually missing is something you cannot see, touch, or photograph. Yesterday, some invisible system was quietly deciding every second what millions of people should make, ship, buy, price, and sell without a single person in charge of the whole thing. What was that system? Where did it come from? And why does almost every country on earth, democracies and one party states, rich nations and poor ones, now depend on some version of it? Before capitalism, let's rewind the clock far enough so you can land in a world that barely changed from one century to the next. For most of recorded history, a person's economic life was actually decided at birth. If your parents farmed a lord's land, you farmed that land. If your parents belonged to a guild of weavers or blacksmiths, that guild decides or decided what you could essentially make and how much you could charge and who you were actually allowed to sell it to. Trade existed. Merchants crossed deserts and ocean, spices and silk moved along western and ancient route, but it moved at the edges of economic life and not through its center. Most people never brought or sold anything beyond their village. They ate what they grew, they wore what they wove, they died within a few miles of where they were actually born. Kings and emperors held enormous power, but even they couldn't simply order prosperity into existence. Folks, economic historians who've actually studied long term growth point to something striking actually report that for most of human history, average living standards barely moved across generations. A farmer in the year 1300 and a farmer in the year 1700 were, in most measurable ways, living the same exact life. Not because they weren't clever, not because they lacked ambition, but because the entire economic system of the pre modern world was actually built to preserve order and not to generate growth. Prices were often set by custom or decrees, not by supply chain and demand. Innovation threatened guild monopolies, so it was frequently restricted rather than rewarded. Land, the single most valuable asset in almost any economy, was inherited, not earned. The world wasn't poor because people didn't work hard. It was actually poor because almost nothing in that system rewarded a stranger for solving another stranger's problem. That, it turns out, is the exact problem capitalism was actually built to solve. Human beings are actually exceptional cooperators, but only at small scale. For let's say, for example, inside a family, a tribe, a village of few hundred people, cooperation comes in very naturally. You know these people, right? You know what I'm actually talking about. You'll see them tomorrow, and if someone cheats you, everyone will know them by sundown. But scale that same problem up to thousands of strangers, then millions, then billions, and the entire foundation cooperation depends on it. Trust, reputation, the threat of social consequences simply stop working. You actually cannot personally vouch for a stranger on the other side of the planet. You cannot threaten their reputation in a village that they have never actually set foot in. For most of history, this is exactly why civilizations stayed small or stayed rigid. Without trust between strangers, you couldn't have long, complex supply chains. Without enforceable contracts or contacts, you couldn't risk lending money to someone who you'd never meet. Without secure property rights, there were very little reason to build something today that a lord, a rival, or a mob might simply seize tomorrow. Banking, in any recognizable modern sense, barely existed. Formal contract laws were thin and unevenly enforced, and property, the right to keep what you built, was in much of the world a privilege granted by power and not a right guaranteed by fundamental law. So, humanity actually faced a problem that had nothing to do with laziness and everything to do with the entire architecture. So, how do you get millions of people who will never meet, never speak the same language, and never build any personal trust to reliably cooperate anyway? Nobody had solved that problem yet. Then, gradually, over a few centuries, someone actually did. Picture it not as an ideology but as an engineering product. The problem: get strangers to cooperate at scale without requiring them to trust, know, or even like each other. The solution that gradually emerged across England, the Netherlands, and eventually much of the world rested on a small number of interlocking parts. The first was private property, a secure, enforceable right to what you build, grow, or own. Not because ownership is sacred, but because without it, nobody has a reliable reason to invest their labor into something long term. Why plant an orchard if someone else might actually simply go ahead and take the harvest? The second was voluntary exchange. Instead of goods moving because a lord commanded it, goods began moving because two strangers, each acting in their own interest, agreed that a trade made between them was actually better off. Neither needed to trust the other's character, they only needed to trust the terms of the deal in front of them. The third was price, a single number that could travel faster than any messenger, carrying information about scarcity and demand to people who would never meet. The fourth was competition. Multiple sellers forced to improve or lower their prices because a customer could simply walk into the next stall. And fifth was actually profit, not as greed but as a signal. Profit told a producer in the cleanest language possible that the world wants more of what you're making, and loss actually told them the exact opposite. Now, none of these 5 points on their own was new. Markets, trade, and properties had existed millennials in scattered partial forms. What was new was actually combining them into a single self reinforcing system, one where each piece needed the other to function, and what the whole system ran without anyone in charge of it. This wasn't a political philosophy waiting to be believed in or waiting to be unveiled, it was a coordination mechanism waiting to be discovered. A price is not just a number on receipt. A price is a compressed packet of information about scarcity, about demand, about risk, about the future, moving through a market faster than any government report, any spreadsheet, any committee could ever actually make it move. Think about your morning cup of coffee. Behind it actually sits an almost incomprehensibly complex supply chain. Farmers in Brazil, roasters, shipping companies, insurance underwriters, currency traders, a barista 3 blocks from your apartment. Not one of these people have actually met all of them, or you haven't actually met all these people, right? And you actually don't need to meet all of them, and none of them actually have to meet each other, because the price of coffee beans on a given morning already contains everything that they need to know, right? Whether this season's harvest was good or whether this season's harvest was bad, whether shipping costs are rising or are they actually declining, whether a frost in one region just makes beans scarcer everywhere else. Now multiply that by everything humans actually go on to produce. The price of oil adjusts sometimes within minutes to a pipeline disruption or distribution on the other side of the planet. And that new price silently tells a trucking company in another country to expect higher fuel costs without anyone actually picking up a phone and conversing about this development. The price your rideshare app quotes you at 11 p.m. on a Friday isn't a random price, it's a live signal putting more drivers onto the road exactly when and where they're actually needed. Airline tickets price shift by the hour, balancing millions of individual travel plans against a fixed number of seats without a single human deciding seat by seat who should pay what. The same logic runs underneath a semiconductor fabrication plant, where the price of a single advanced chip reflects a global scramble for rare materials, factory capacity, and years of accumulated engineering knowledge consolidated into one number that a buyer on the other side of the world can act on almost instantly. Even sometimes, as small as pencil turns out to be almost unbelievably complicated. Wood from one country, graphite mined in another, rubber, paint, metal, each sourced, processed, and shipped by people who have never spoken to each other and never will. In 1958, an economist named Leonard Reed wrote a short essay making exactly this particular point, that not one single person on earth knows how to make a pencil, start to finish, alone. And yet, pencils are everywhere, made reliably, priced so cheaply that nobody thinks twice about losing one. That's the trick. Nobody is the charge of the pencil in the actual supply chain. Nobody is in the charge of the copy supply chain or the semiconductor supply chain or the global supply chain. There is no central office deciding how much wheat the world actually needs this year, or how many microphones should go into cars instead of how many microphones should go into cars instead of laptops. And yet, day after day, roughly the right amount of almost everything ends up roughly in the right place. Economists have a name for the mechanism doing that particular work, the price system. In 1945, economist Friedrich Hayek argued that the deepest genius of a market isn't that it's actually efficient, it's that it solves a problem no human mind or government or a supercomputer could solve on its own, gathering millions of scattered, constantly changing and evaluating pieces of local knowledge and compressing them into a single number simple enough for a stranger to act on instantly. No precedent, no central planner, no algorithm has ever fully matched what millions of prices adjusting in real time do automatically. Try to imagine assigning one government office the job of deciding the correct price of every item in a supermarket, updated every hour based on weather, harvests, currency shifts, and consumer mood for every country on earth simultaneously. It's not that this has never been attempted. Command economies, most notably the Soviet Union, the matter of fact, spent decades trying to set production targets and prices by central planning instead of markets, and consistently struggled with shortages of some goods and gluts of others, precisely because no planning office could gather and update information as fast as a live price could actually go on to do. And this is why, ladies and gentlemen, capitalism isn't best understood as a system about money. It's actually a system about information, about letting millions of small local facts known only to people living them aggregate into a single or a signal that the whole world can actually act on almost immediately. Now, coordination alone doesn't explain the next part of the story. Why did human material life, essentially flat or millennia, suddenly start climbing and never really stop? Start with something Adam Smith noticed in 1770s, watching workers in a pin factory. One worker doing every step alone might go on to make handful of pins a day, right? But divide that same job into 18 smaller steps and assign one worker each step, and the same group could actually produce thousands of pins a day between them. Now, nothing about the worker had actually changed, only the organization of their labor had a small change. That's the specialization, and it does something almost magical. It lets each person become extraordinarily good at one narrow thing instead of adequate at everything. Multiply that across an entire economy, and you get a great civilization where millions of people are each slightly world class at something, trading the fruits of that expertise with millions of others in the open market. But specialization alone doesn't explain compounding, right? Or it doesn't go on to justify the compounding growth. For that, you need capital, you need tools, you need machines, you need factories, you need infrastructures built not for today's needs, but built as an investment for tomorrow's output. A farmer with a tractor can feed far more people than a farmer with a hand plow. But building the tractor first required someone to delay consumption, save resources, and risk them on a machine that might not pay off instantly. That willingness to risk resources today for uncertain reward tomorrow is entrepreneurship. It's easy to romanticize it and very easy to mock, but at its core, it's actually very simple. Someone notices an unmet need, gathers capital, absorbs the risk of being wrong, and if they are right, both they and their customers end up better off. If they are wrong, they absorb the loss, which is precisely the signal from the last chapter telling the rest of the economy where not to send more resources. Do this enough times across enough industries for long enough, and something remarkable actually happens. Wealth doesn't just add up, it compounds. A slightly better tool builds a slightly larger surplus, which funds a slightly better tool, which builds a slightly larger surplus. Run that loop across 2 centuries instead of 2 years, and the numbers stop looking incremental and start looking absolutely exponential. This is why, ladies and gentlemen, historically, once a society assembles secure property rights, functioning markets, access to capital, and genuine competition, growth tends to stop being a rare event and starts becoming the default condition. Not guaranteed, not automatic, but no longer nearly impossible, the way it had been for almost the entirety of human history before. Which raises an obvious question: humans are not smarter today than they were 3000 years ago. So, why did almost all of humanity's transformative technology arrive in just the 250 years? Start with the steam engine. Practical steam power, refined in Britain in the late 1700s, didn't just move train, it decouped production from human and animal muscle for the very first time in history, turning coal into raw mechanical force on a scale no civilization had actually commanded. Factories no longer needed to sit beside a river for water power, they could go wherever labor, capital, and customers made actual sense. Electricity did something a century later, you know, underneathing machines from centralized steam plants entirely, letting power reach individual homes, tools, and eventually individuals' devices. Railways compressed distance itself, turning a week's journey into a day's. Cars compressed it further down to individual and the hour. But raw intervention isn't the whole story, because plenty of societies before capitalism produced brilliant individual inventions than that. So, what changed wasn't the ideas, right? It was the incentive to develop them, scale them, and sell them to millions of ordinary people in the open market. Patents and enforceable property rights meant an inventor could actually capture some of the value that they created instead of watching a more powerful rival simply come and seize the entire idea. Competitive markets actually meant that if you don't improve your product, somebody else would, and would take your customers while you are actually doing it. And profit again meant that success was rewarded richly enough to justify the risk of trying all of it. Put an incentive to innovation on top of a system built to move capital toward good ideas away from the bad ones, and you get something historically unprecedented. An economy that doesn't just tolerate change but actively hunts for it. Computers, the internet, and now artificial intelligence are simply the latest chapters of the same pattern compressed into shorter and shorter time frames. The steam engine took decades to reshape the world, the internet took years, large scale artificial intelligence tools took months. The pace itself is the story. Innovation didn't just happen more, it just happened faster and faster and faster because the entire system had been rebuilt piece by piece to reward exactly that. No honest account of this system can stop here. because the same mechanism that built extraordinary prosperity have repeatedly and precisely and predictively produced real harm as well. Start with the earliest, ugliest chapter. The same industrial revolution that multiplied productivity also failed or filled factories with children working brutal hours in dangerous conditions. Because in an unregulated market, a factory owner who refused to use the cheapest labor available could simply be undercut by a rival who would simply go on to accept that challenge. It took decades of public pressure and eventually government regulations to actually change that. The market alone did not fix it, law did. A factory that dumps waste into a river gets to keep the profit, while the cost, the polluted water, the damaged health of everyone downstream is paid by the people who were never part of the transaction at all. Economists call this an externality, a cost the price system a cost that the price system actually fails to capture, because the person paying isn't the one who's actually making the decision. Climate change is at global scale the same problem. The market of burning fuel has historically reflected almost none of its long term costs to the planet. Markets left alone also tend over a period of time toward concentration. A company that actually wins fairly today can use that success to buy out undercut competitors or simply outlast its rival until the competition is actually alive. The very same thing disciplining prices and quality slowly starts to disappear. Governments in many countries have spent over a century building super trust specifically to fight this pattern, because a market without real competition stops behaving like a coordinated system described earlier in this video, and it actually starts behaving like the very kings and guilds capitalism was supposed to replace. Financial markets bring their own instability because prices reflect not just information but expectation. They can detach from underlying reality for a while, inflate, and then collapse all of it at once, taking ordinary savings, job, and entire economies down with them. The global crisis of 2008 remains one of the starkest modern reminders that complex, poorly understood financial products combined with weak oversight and went on to turn a housing downtown into a near collapse of the global banking system. Inequality is a harder question, and reasonable economists disagree sharply about its causes and its actual consequences. What's not seriously disputed is this: markets reward the value someone's capturing, right? Not necessarily the value someone creates. And those two things can be worlds apart. A caregiver, a teacher, a subsequent farmer may generate enormous social value while capturing very little of it in terms of actual price. A skilled trader may capture enormous value while generating comparatively little, and that difference is almost going to be there in every single set of examples, and we cannot go on to debate that. But the markets are vulnerable to subtle failure, regulatory capture, where the very industry a government sets out to regulate ends up quietly shaping the rules meant to constrain them, turning oversight into protection for incumbents instead. Now, none of this means that the coordination mechanism from the earlier chapters is a myth. Prices still carry real information, competition still disciplines real producers, but every single one of these failures shares a common root. Markets are extraordinarily good at pricing what can be measured and reliably bad at pricing what can't. A child's safety, a river's health, a stable climate, a fair chance of opportunity left with no correlation at all. The same system that builds abundance can just as easily concentrate it or externalize its costs onto people who never agreed to pay the big price that they're actually paying subconsciously. Which brings us to a genuine puzzle of the last century. If capitalism carries these real identities, well documented flaws, why did country after country across widely different political systems gradually go on to adopt some version of it and go on to do it anyways? The United States runs on one of the most market driven large economies on earth, but even it regulates food safety, sets minimum wages in most states, and ensures bank deposits, and also goes on to run enormous public health and retirement programs. That's not capitalism in pure sense, right? Or the textbook sense. It's just a hybrid model of capitalism. Take China. China, often perhaps the starkest illustration of the shift, right? Because in the beginning, in the late 1970s, under a program of economic reform often described as reform and opening up, China began allowing private enterprises, market pricing, and foreign investment while keeping one party political system firmly in place. The results actually went on to reshape the size of the Chinese economy very dramatically over the following decades. And China's government still describes its system as socialist, but in everyday mechanics, prices, competition, private firms, profit, incentives are unmistakably drawn from the same toolkit this video has been describing for the past 20 minutes. Vietnam also went on to follow a similar path in the 1980s, moving from a centrally planned economy towards market mechanisms while its political system stayed largely unchanged. India spent its early decades after independence favoring heavy state planning, then gradually opened its economy to markets and competition starting in the early 1990s, unlocking growth that state planning alone would have actually struggled to deliver. Even the countries most often held up as capitalism's product oppose and complicate the entire picture. The Nordic countries, frequently described in casual conversations as socialists, are, by technical economic definitions, market economies. Private companies compete, price moves freely, the profit still drives production. What sets them apart is in the absence of the market, it's an unusually large welfare state funded by some of the highest tax paying rates in the world, layered on top of a market economy underneath. Nordic leaders themselves have periodically pushed back on socialist labor for exactly the same reasons. Singapore complicates the picture from another direction entirely. An economy built on aggressively open market and foreign investments, sitting alongside a state that owns significant stakes in major companies and direct long term national strategies with a heavier hand than most Western economies would have actually gone on to tolerate. Look closely at all of these cases side by side, and a pattern starts to emerge. The debate that dominated the 20th century, capitalism versus socialism, markets versus the state, has quietly been replaced by a narrow, more practical question inside almost every government on planet Earth, which is which problems should markets solve and which problem actually requires the state to step in. Housing, healthcare, education, infrastructure, and financial regulation are answered differently in Stockholm, in Singapore, in Shanghai, in San Francisco. But in every one of these cities, prices, competition, and private enterprises are doing the real, substantial, and the ground level work. That convergence arrived independently by countries with almost nothing else in common is itself a kind of evidence, not proof, that markets are actually perfect. Proof that no government, regardless of ideology, has yet found a better tool for solving the coordination problem that this video actually opened with. Every coordination system eventually meets a problem it wasn't originally designed for. Capitalism, built over centuries around human labor as its central input, is now colliding with a technology that increasingly doesn't need human labor at all. Artificial intelligence and automation raise a question the price system has never really had an answer for. Which happens to be a coordination mechanism built on people trading their labor for income when machines can perform an ever growing share of that particular labor more cheaply and consistently than people can actually do. Some economists argue that this is simply the next iteration of a very old pattern. The steam engine displaced hand weavers, the tractor displaced farm hands, and in both cases, new industries eventually absorbed and displaced labor, and living standards rose regardless. Others argue that this time it's structurally different because AI threatens to automate not just the physical labor, but the cognitive and the creative work that previously waves of automation left untouched. That disagreement has already produced concrete policy experiments: universal basic income, a regular unconditional cash payment to every citizen, and has also been piloted in various forms in multiple countries as one of the possible answers to an economy that might need fewer workers to produce the same output. Digital currencies and programmable monies raise a different question: whether the core of infrastructure of exchange itself, which is the currency, the payment, the contracts, might be rebuilt into an entirely new technical foundation within a new generation. Climate change poses perhaps the deepest structural test of all, because it's the clearest case where the price system on its own systematically failed to account for a real cost. Carbon pricing, emission trading, and green subsidies are in effect attempts to force environmental cost back into the price signal, correcting exactly the kind of externality described earlier in this video. None of these forces, ladies and gentlemen, guarantee capitalism's collapse, and none of them guarantee its triumph either. What they guarantee is a change. The version of this system operating in a century from now will almost look certainly different from today, and today's look from the guild economies of 500 years ago. The coordination problem won't disappear, but the tools solving it never stay still for long. So, what is capitalism once you strip out the money, the stock triggers, and the Wall Street mythology? It's an answer to the oldest organizational problem our species have ever faced. How do you get millions and eventually billions of people who have never met each other, never spoken the same language, and never personally trusted another person to reliably work together any which ways? For most of human history, nobody had a good answer. Then gradually an answer emerged, built not from a simple genius or single decrees, but from property rights, voluntary exchange, prices, competition, and profit layering together into a system nobody fully designed and nobody fully controls. It's not a perfect system yet, and it's never claimed to be. And I am also not claiming that's a perfect system. It has produced monopolies alongside abundance, pollution alongside progress, and staggering wealth alongside real persistent hardship. Its greatest strength is that it adapts, correcting itself through competition, regulation, and pressure generation after generation. Its greatest weakness is actually that it reflects human incentives exactly as they are, including our short sightedness, our greed, and our blind spots, not as we wish them to be represented. The future isn't really a choice between capitalism and some other named alternative waiting in the wings. It's a quieter and a much harder question. What incentives do we want to build into the system future generation will actually go on to inherit? Every civilization is ultimately defined by how it solves one question. How do millions of people, millions of strangers work together? Capitalism was humanity's most influential answer. Whether it remains the best answer is a question every generation must decide for itself.